Last year, I asked you guys what your must-have desserts were for your Christmas gathering, and you responded. So much like what we did back in our Thanksgiving episode, we're going to be making your favorite, as decided by the votes, Christmas desserts from scratch, and possibly even better than you thought they could be. That being said, at this point, it's only 5 days away from Christmas, so there's no time to talk, no time for alternate angle intros. Let's get cooking. It's crunch time. So we're going to start things off with a super simple pie crust, and in this container is 3 cups of all-purpose flour, and I've just added in a tablespoon each of table salt and granulated sugar, and once that's combined, the rest of this is going to come together in the food processor. So all I'm going to do here is add in roughly half of my flour, and then we're going to go in with a half a cup of lard. Now this may not seem like an obvious choice here. You can certainly use all butter for this, but I'm recreating a very modified version of the pie crust we used back in April for those fried pies. So this will work perfectly in this context, and also it's a great use of this lard that's just been sitting around because I never really use it. Alright, so after we've gotten that all nice and added in, and as you can see, I've broken it up into smaller pieces. And from here, we're just going to simply lock on our lid to our food processor and pulse this on the dough setting for maybe about 10 to 15 seconds. And at this time, I noticed there was a piece of lard sticking to the side of our food processor. So I just took a spatula and worked it down into the mix and let it continue to process for the rest of the dough cycle. And at this point, I am checking to make sure everything is broken down. It should feel kind of like a moist sort of sand, not wet or dry. And then at this point, we're just going to add in the rest of our remaining flour mixture, making sure we cover our deep fryer toaster and remaining work surface with that flour, just like I did. And at this point, we're going to add in 1 stick or half a cup of unsalted butter that has been cut into smaller pieces, and make sure that it is ice cold. It has to be straight from the fridge, otherwise the fat's going to be too soft and turn our dough into a pasty mixture and become unworkable. Then we're just going to slap the lid back onto our food processor and let it go on the dough cycle until all of our butter has been thoroughly processed. And when you do your texture test like I'm doing here, the dough should feel kind of like dampish beach sand. Grainy particles with only like pea-sized pellets of fat. That's all you're looking for here. And then straight from the freezer, we're going to be streaming in 1/4 cup of ice cold water. Again, it needs to be ice cold. And then we're going to stream this in batches, all the while processing on the dough cycle until we've used all of our water, and until a shaggy dough starts to form and can cleanly pass the sides of our processor, kind of like what you're seeing here. And another way to test to make sure your dough is perfectly formed is if you can mold it into a log like I've done here without it being too wet or without it falling apart. And now we're going to relieve our good friend the food processor of his duties and transfer this out onto a lightly floured work surface. And I know what you guys might be saying right now. It looks like some kid just emptied their sandbox onto my cutting board. But trust me, this comes together. This is the only time we use elbow grease in the making of this dough. So what I'm doing here is grabbing everything and starting a process of slap and folds to start the lamination. I know this looks like a hot mess right now, but that's because the fats in the dough are cold and seized up in our mixture. But after about 3 minutes, we see it starting to come together, and as the fats warm up while we're kneading and folding, it's going to turn into a nice smooth dough. And after 7 minutes, this is what we have. A beautifully smooth and round ball of dough. Ain't she purty? And this is enough to give us 2 whole pies. And while I'm usually a big advocate of measuring things by sight, I'm bringing out my kitchen scale because accuracy is everything. We did not work this hard to make an incredible pie dough just to have ill-proportioned pies. So this one weighs out at about 710 grams. So we need to split this in 2 equal pieces that weigh 355 grams apiece. This is the only way to prevent a pie fail. And once we've appropriately measured out both of our pie pieces, we're going to roll them into some nice tight little balls and press them into some discs and cover them with some freshly massacred shrink wrap and put them in the fridge for about 40 minutes. This is crucial because we need the fats inside the dough to refrigerate and tighten up again. As we've learned throughout the year working with butter pastry, if it gets too warm or overworked, it's going to leak out of the crevices, and then your pie crust will be ruined. And Santa specifically sends cold to those who make up pies. Choose wisely. It's been 40 minutes, so it's time to roll the dough. So we're going to place one of these pie discs onto a lightly floured work surface, and we are going to gently roll this out. Now this is a conscious decision for me not having the rag underneath my cutting board, because we're going to need to turn this about a 1/4 turn each time we roll this out. we're looking to make a cohesive circle about 12 inches wide. Now guys, if you notice you're starting to get splits or rips in your dough as you're working it, you can always press them back together and be sure to use a little extra flour. And always for reference, I always keep my pie tin near to make sure that I have the right size circle. We're looking for about 1.5 inches of overhang. Once we have that properly measured out, we're going to very loosely and gently roll this to a rolling pin. Don't worry if there's any small rips that form. We can figure that out and smooth it out once we center it into our pie pan, which we're doing right here. Don't worry if it's not exactly dead center. I'm going to very gently move this dough back to make sure that it's nice and seated into our pan. Now don't worry right now about the edges that have fallen off. This is still salvageable no matter how rough this looks at the moment. So what I'm doing now is trimming off any remaining overhang to about 1 inch. And then after that, we're just going to tuck it up underneath our pie crust to create a thick border wall, which is what we need in a traditional pie crust. Now once we've gotten the remaining overhang situated, we're going to take those remaining pieces that have fallen off. I'm going to be using them to construct the remaining outer crust. Also, I am being very mindful to rotate this pie crust as I go, thinning out any large chunks of dough to make sure that there's an even thickness of crust all the way around the perimeter of my pie. And after a couple minutes, this is what it looks like, and honestly this looks pretty darn good. Now that being said, since the walls of this pie tin are so high, we can't go for the traditional hand crimped crust here, so we're going to have to do something a little bit different. And the only common sense move to make here is to do the traditional tine mark pattern using a fork. And guys, when you're doing this, be mindful not to be too rough with the dough. Too much pressure at this point can puncture our dough, creating a butter leak and potentially ruining our product. I was going to put this to the side to work on our second pie crust, then tragedy happened. In the transfer, this thing gave up completely, making it completely unsalvageable. But that being said, we march on. So I'm simply just going to put a lid on this pie tin and set it in the freezer to chill for 40 minutes, in which time I'm going to head up to the road to the dollar store to buy some much needed rebound items like a second pie crust and some much needed caffeine. And as soon as I returned, my pie crust was ready to come out of the freezer. So what I've done here is measured out and cut a circle piece of parchment paper that I crumpled intentionally so it can better mold to my crust. And then we're going to add in about 2 pounds of dried rice. You can use dried beans or even pie weights. And this is called blind baking. No, it's not like it sounds. This is not me baking without my glasses, which would be literal blind baking and slightly traumatic. This is the act of par baking our crust to ensure full pie success. So we have placed our cold crust directly into an oven preheated to 425 degrees for 15 minutes. And once we pull this bad boy out, you can see that it is not fully cooked. We're just crisping and browning it to make sure it doesn't go soggy when the wet ingredients go in. And once it comes out, we're going to simply remove and discard the rice or save it for later. And before we set this to the side to cool completely, because it does need to cool completely, if you find there are any bubbles that start to form at the bottom of your pie crust, just take a fork and pop them out very lightly. And I would like to let you know that I had no bubbles at the bottom of my pie crust at any point during its cooling, so this does indeed work. And it's finally time to talk about our fillings, not feelings. So what's on the board is 1.5 cups of plain pecans. Now guys, you can get this in pieces already, but it's much more expensive. So all we're doing now is putting a rough chop on it. Does not have to be fine or fancy. And yes, I'm using a grossly oversized knife to do this with, because this is the time of year where people want to shank their in-laws. And while that's illegal, this is not. Just take it on the pecans, or pecans, would you? And from here, we're going to transfer our chopped nuts into a cold, dry pan over medium-high heat and proceed to toast these for a few minutes. Now guys, this is completely optional, but I do recommend it because it amplifies the flavor to the next level. And this is not even going to take 10 minutes. About 2 minutes through, I'm going to give them a good old flip to ensure even heating. And we're not even trying to really achieve any sort of color. We're just trying to get that fragrance to come out and activate the oils. And honestly, after about 6 minutes, I'm already starting to smell the wonderful aroma throughout the house. So now we're going to take them directly off the heat and pour them into our fully cooled pie shell. And then after that, we need to go ahead and start assembling our goo. This is the stuff that makes pecan pie what it is. I don't know what you call it, but it's definitely goo. So we're going to start off with 3/4 cup of dark brown sugar that I've packed. Now guys, you can use light brown sugar, but any kind will work. So we're just going to break it up to make sure no clumps exist. And this is where I put my twist on things. This is 3/4 of a cup of light corn syrup. Now guys, a lot of folks use dark, but I'm not. So to that, we're going to be adding in 1/4 of a cup of real maple syrup. Make sure it's a good one now. And then we're going to add that into our brown sugar. Now guys, I don't like a heavy corn syrup taste. I find it kind of off-putting. So I went with a lighter option. And between the maple syrup and the dark brown sugar, we're going to kind of create that same intense darkness that you would normally have otherwise. And then this is just 4 tablespoons of melted unsalted butter that's been sitting at room temperature for probably about 45 minutes. We don't want it hot. And once we got that combined and looking like a nice caramel, we're going to add in 3 large eggs. This is kind of like a loose custard sort of caramel thing. So after we get all those nice eggs combined in and everything is beautifully emulsified, we are going to hit this up with 2 teaspoons of vanilla because we can't have it without. And then I almost forgot, but we need to give this a nice pinch of kosher salt. I'm being a little generous with this because of all the concentrated sugars we have between the corn syrup and the maple syrup. So this is going to bring a lot of balance and tame down some of those sweet notes. Also, by roasting our pecans, this is also going to bring balance as well, taming down some of those sugary notes. Anywhere from 3/4 of a teaspoon to a full teaspoon of kosher salt will be fine. And after we've gotten that all nice and mixed in, we're going to pour this directly over our pecans. Then we're going to grease up the edges of our pie crust with a beautiful egg wash consisting of 1 egg and a splash of water. And then we're going to slam this bad boy into the oven set to 425 degrees for 15 minutes. And after that, we're going to reduce the temp to 350 and let it cook for about another 35 to 40 minutes. And at any time, if you notice your crust is taking on a little too much color or starting to turn a nice golden black, you can pull it and loosely tint with foil if needed. And now thankfully I didn't need to do that, and after 35 minutes my pie was completely done. And you can determine that if your sides are completely set with just a slight wobble in the center. And let's take a look at that beautifully cooked pie. Now that being said, we need to let this cool completely, so let's move on to our next one. And it ain't Christmas without pumpkin pie, and in this container is a 15-ounce can of pumpkin puree. Make sure it's puree and not pie filling, that stuff is fake. And to that we're going to add 1 large egg and 3 egg yolks at room temperature. This is going to become a pumpkin custard, so we're going to mix that together until everything is smooth and homogeneous. And to that we're going to be adding in 1.5 teaspoons of my homemade pumpkin pie spice. You can use the stuff in the bottles, that's fine as well, but this stuff is amazing. Don't worry, I have the recipe in the description along with everything else today. And once we get that nice and combined, we're going to go in with our sugars. And the first thing in is 1/2 cup of dark brown sugar packed. Now guys, you can use light brown, but I usually only have dark. Either will work. And after we get that thoroughly incorporated, we're going to hit it up with an additional 1/4 cup of regular granulated sugar. You'll see why very shortly. And then an additional pinch of kosher salt. Not nearly as much as we use in the pecan pie. About 1/2 teaspoon will do because all those pie spices will help regulate the sweetness of the pie. And then we're going to add in our secret ingredient. This is 3/4 of a cup of heavy whipping cream. Now you guys might be wondering why I'm using this. Because we had 2 sugars in the batter, we have totally eliminated the need to use things like sweetened condensed milk. And also by using real heavy whipping cream, you're going to get a richness that the stuff out of the can will not give you. This next step is completely optional but worth it if you have the time. All we're doing here is very gently heating our pumpkin custard over a medium heat. We're not really looking to cook this all the way through, but it's going to ensure that it cooks evenly in the oven instead of putting it in cold. And while we have a second, let's talk about our crust situation. This here is a Dollar General graham cracker crust, and this is definitely not something that you would think about when doing pumpkin pie, but let me tell you, this is something that's outside of the box but really works well with the flavors of pumpkin pie. And honestly, that mistake with the second crust turned into an opportunity to show you guys how to do something that's delicious and outside the box. And moving back to our beautiful pumpkin custard, once we've reached the temperature of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, it's time to pull it off the heat and load our crust with it. And this crust is a little bit smaller than the one that I made, so it's actually pretty full. So we're going to follow the exact instructions as our last pie. We're going to put it on 425 degrees for 15 minutes and then lower it to 350. And since it's so dense, I'm going to let it go for 40 minutes, but I'm still going to check it at the 35 mark. We just don't want this filling to be undercooked. And much to my surprise, at 35 minutes, this thing was perfectly cooked, same standards as last time, set edges, a slight wobble in the center, and absolutely zero cracking. Take a look at that beauty. Now, I am starting to notice some structural integrity of the pie crust starting to falter. The 5-star reviews on this thing said it was pretty much the only pie crust that doesn't crack. I'm pretty sure Dollar General planted those reviews on there just like they plant their new stores on the side of the road when we're not looking. I'm onto you, DG. And after about an hour and a half later, both of our pies have fully cooled down to room temp, so let's try these beautiful slices. Alright guys, that's a wrap. It's been an incredibly long day. It's been almost 8 hours since we started this adventure, but I'm still pretty proud of what we've done here. Now, a little story about this pumpkin pie. It actually had 0 cracks in it when it came out of the oven, but as it, set, and it's only been out of the oven for maybe about an hour and 15 minutes, it started to crack. I will say the crust held up okay. I mean, it is a Dollar General crust, but the thing is this is going to pair better with pumpkin than you think, and this is absolutely perfect. It just needed to be chilled a little more to solidify. So the only thing to do now is to try it out. Starting with the pumpkin pie, the quintessential Christmas pie. And all I've done here is made some fresh whipped cream with a little sugar and a little vanilla, topped with some cinnamon. It would be 10 times better if it was cold. On the other hand, I have no fridge space, so I did what I had to do here. So the thing about this is kind of a genius save, even though it is what it is here. The seasoning, the taste of the graham cracker crust bolsters the naturally existing flavors of the pumpkin pie. Not to the point where it's overwhelming, but it just intensifies that flavor and gives you more. And more is always more, and I like that, especially with pumpkin pie. This would be even better cold because all the flavors got a chance to concentrate. Hands down, this is definitely worth a shot, and it's definitely better than those store-bought pies. There's none of that fake flavor in there. Now this I'm most excited about. This is the fresh pecan pie with the homemade crust. Again, for me, pie is a dish best served cold, but oh my god. The crust is the perfect texture. And it has the best flavor to foil, the sweet notes. And the one thing that I will say here that I love about this is this has all the flavor of a traditional pecan pie, but it doesn't have that mouth-burning, tongue-burning sweetness that you do when you get store-bought pies. By substituting a 1/4 cup of that light corn syrup with the maple syrup, we have a natural sweetness, and that's kind of what I'm all about here, is natural sweetness. Nothing beats it. And this has it. And guys, I really suggest you try it this way. Again, if this had like an hour in the fridge, this would be a 10 out of 10. So, what I will say is I'll keep working on my pie shell recipe, and there will be a rematch for sure. Also, Merry Christmas, everybody. 8 hours, 3 dish loads later, and still somehow 2 full loads of dishes. I'm even doing a cut scene so you can see this. However, and that's even with physical therapy. There's one else that physical therapy, even though this is being released 5 days ahead of Christmas. In reality, it's April 7th, and I'm happy to be back in the kitchen doing what I do and doing what I love to do. And guys, no matter what, you don't have to do both of these or any of these. This is just to open your mind to the possibilities that you can do to bring home something better for Christmas. I love all of you, regardless of your spiritual beliefs, if you have any. Joy is here. Enjoy each other. Enjoy good food, and that's what this channel's all about. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And also, don't forget that I love you. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and I will see you next week.